9 o'clock in the morning, and I know we have quite a few folks on the line. So good morning to all of you. We're having Solidarity Economics from the couch today. I know that many of you are joining us from various places. I love seeing Matt outdoors with his Dreamer logo behind him. That's a great framing. And I know that we're going to have quite a few folks coming in over the next couple of minutes. So we're going to give them an opportunity to do that. And I know that John is going to join us from LA Care, and there's a lot of folks coming in. So John, when you do make it on, please do announce yourself so that we know you're with us. And then over the next about 5 minutes, we're gonna, let folks continue logging in. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. We did our Zoom tutorial, but our Zoom master, Lauren Perez, is still with us and happy to answer any questions that you might have before we officially begin the program. All right. Getting up there. Almost to 50. A few more folks, I'm sure, will join in, but maybe join in a little late. Oh my goodness. That's pretty cool there, Dr. Pastor. You look like you went off into the ends of the world there. We can't hear you.
I'm back now. I figured out how to put a USC Peer logo behind me, mostly because Chris figured out how to do it, and then he's always technologically more advanced than I.
All righty, well, it is 9:05, which means it is time for us to get started. And I know I was looking for John from LA Care. Are you with us yet this morning?
It's here.
He's here?
Yeah, somewhere. I just made him a co-host.
Okay. So John and Veronica, I know you're both with us. I want to again welcome everyone to our convening today, Solidarity Economics for the Coalition on Economic Resiliency. We're super excited that all of you are taking time this morning to join us. I know these are the strangest of times, but as we said in many of the messages we sent you, we definitely need to have these conversations now more than ever. And so, once again, really looking forward to the day. To welcome you, we have Veronica Flores, who's the CEO of Community Health Councils and our Social Change Institute, and John Backus, who is the CEO of LA Care Health Plan and our primary sponsor and supporter for this coalition. So both of you, please do. The show is yours.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we do.
Good. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're actually very grateful for the partnership that we've been able to acquire to produce this type of convening, particularly the Federal Reserve of San Francisco, USC Program for Environmental and Regional Equity, and the USC Institute for Social Transformation. I also want to thank John Backus, who is the CEO of LA Care Plan, for his continued support and leadership around our Coalition on Economic Resilience. COVID-19 has forced us all to think and act more proactively in response to one of the greatest global and local challenges we have ever faced. This is a time for action and ideas. This is why we formed this coalition, and I am ready to work with all of you so that we can do this collectively, so that we can find solutions towards some of these critical economic issues we are now facing. John, I want to thank you for being with us today, and welcome. John?
Hi, good morning. Sorry, I was just winding up a traditional conference call with the state. So I'm trying to do video and conference calling all at the same time. Anyway, I do want to welcome everyone. And Veronica, it's good to see you because I haven't seen you in a long time. I'm wearing this hat because my hair looks like hell because I haven't had a haircut in a long time. But I think how prescient when you organized this last year, getting us ready for the next recession. And who knew that it would happen this fast and under these circumstances? But LA Care is very happy to be part of this group and part of the discussion we're going to have. It's critical that we be addressing this as a community and work as cooperatively as together as possible. I just want to mention that we are projecting that due to the recession that's beginning to take hold, that the enrollment in Medi-Cal here in California is going to go up dramatically. We're looking at forecasts that we will add 1.5 million to 3 million people to Medi-Cal statewide in the next few months. Remember, we already had 13 million people in Medi-Cal in California, a third of the state. So it's going to be even more important that we work cooperatively with the safety net providers and the social service agencies that support our members as we bring on all these new folks. Unlike the Affordable Care Act expansion, however, these people we hope will be temporary, meaning that they'll be with us maybe a year or two before they can get back to whatever their previous employment was. But we're going to have to manage them, make sure they get access, and it's also going to require that we work to expand our provider network so that we have enough providers to take care of this group of people. So I'm sure we'll be dialoguing with many of you on this call. over the next couple of months. And I appreciate your being here today and encourage us to continue to work together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Veronica. Really, really appreciate, both of you so much for your thought leadership and supporting this effort over the last several months. As you can see, we weren't fast enough. We all should have been working far harder. But I know, here we are, and we're going to continue moving forward. I just want to really quickly take a moment before this gets too far down the line to thank and acknowledge the folks who helped really make this happen behind the scenes. And Lauren and Vanessa and Mackenzie, thank you so much for all of the time that you guys spent logistically making this happen. We're all learning some really important and valuable new skills in the Zoom world. We're learning new vocabularies like Zoom bombs. So thank you for the increased level of security that you also implemented to keep us safe today as we were discussing these serious topics. And I want to thank all the folks who are going to be our facilitators. You also spend a little extra time, learning a few new tricks that are going to get us through the day as well. So thank you, for that. Greatly appreciate it. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing today is our fast pitch for solutions. For those of you who have been on this train with us for the last several months, you'll know that is not a pitch for money, but really a pitch for passion. And so the folks who are going to be pitching today are really passionate about the topics that they're going to explain to you and the strategies that they think will help to make a difference. Very similar to Dr. Pastor and Dr. Benner, who've clearly been doing this work for many decades. I won't say how many because I'm sure that they are both only in their early 20s at this point. So, but somehow they have a world of wisdom, to share with us. So I'm certainly excited to get that started. And I am not an expert yet, so I'm going to move over here to my other screen so that I can properly introduce them. So Dr. Pastor, as you know, is with the, I'm doing this out of order. Forgive me. I'm going to start with Dr. Benner because that's where my script is. So Dr. Chris Benner is the Dorothy Everett Chair in Global Information and Social Entrepreneurship and a professor of environmental studies and sociology at the University of California at Santa Cruz. He directs the Everett Program for Technology and Social Change and the Santa Cruz Institute for Social Transformation. His research examines the relationships between technological change, regional development, and the structure of employment. He has authored or co-authored 6 books, including Equity, Growth, and Community with Dr. Manuel Pastor. Dr. Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at USC. He currently directs the program for environmental and regional equity at USC Center for the Study of Immigration Integration. Dr. Pastor holds an economics PhD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and is the inaugural holder, and I'm going to mess this up, of the Turpingian. Is that how we say it, Dr. Pastor?
Turpangian.
Thank you. At the Turpangian Chair. He's the Turpangian Chair. So he is going to walk us through the beginning of his presentation, and I'm sure Dr. Pastor and he will continue to guide us today. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And I hope everybody can see the screen. First slide. Chris, I can see just you. Can you nod? Great. So great to be with you. Unlike John Backus, I was able to get a haircut because my wife has some pretty extraordinary skills. However, one of the things I've learned from Zooming over this whole period of time is that people got tired of looking at all the black shirts in my closet. And so I've now put up a Dornsife USC peer screen behind me. We have only 20 minutes to summarize, I think, 2 decades of working together on sort of a different economic vision for the United States and really for the world. So I'm going to kind of jump right into it. And the way to kind of think about this is that the coronavirus disease has actually revealed some fundamental underlying sicknesses in our society. They've underlined the fact that so many people are asset poor, something an asset that Ann Price will talk about later, and particularly the racial wealth gap that exists there in terms of whether or not people have assets to persist in an emergency. The wide number of people without health insurance or with inadequate health insurance, who may not even have access to decent health care if they do indeed have the health insurance. And certainly what's been revealed in the last couple of weeks, although it was pretty obvious to those of us who knew about it before, were the sharp racial disparities in terms of the vulnerabilities to this health crisis and the way in which structural inequality in its multiple dimensions around health, access to housing, access to food, access to employment results in the kinds of disparities that we're seeing emerge right now. But what's interesting is that there's a set of lessons emerging from the current period which are actually good in a crisis and they're good in the long run. The public health principle that we protect ourselves when we protect others, the idea that we're seeing right now in the way that people are practicing physical distancing in order to promote the health not just of themselves but of others, the idea that mutual caring and support can actually lead to better health and better economic outcomes. The idea that the public and private sector are not separate but interlinked. You're not really going to get the private economy going until we get the public health parts of this correct in terms of testing and massive expansion. And certainly in this crisis, the massive intervention of the federal government has been necessary. The last thing which I think really should be clear from this is that change only happens through collective and community action. It's partly the government, but it's also the way in which all of us have bonded together to try to deal with this crisis. Now, this is particularly important in California because we were practicing social distance before we knew it was a word. That is social distance in terms of wide inequality by income and by class. California is the 5th largest economy. And in the 1960s, it was pretty much in the middle of the pack in terms of the US states in terms of the level of income inequality. This is a measure of income inequality called the Gini coefficient, pretty standard. California is now America's 4th most unequal state, outpacing such places as Alabama and Mississippi. So we've got serious problems of social distance and social inequality, and they have a significant racial dimension as well. This on the left-hand side is median household income by race and ethnicity, and you can see if you're looking at the graph that Black and Latino household incomes are far lower than they are for whites. API incomes are actually higher, but that masks the bifurcation in that community between one group of Asian American and Pacific Islanders who are doing quite well, and another group, particularly Filipinos and Southeast Asians, who are not doing so well. But what's fascinating is if you move to the graph on the right, it's looking at the same sort of income disparities for households, but looking at households who have children under 5. And there you can see that the gaps, particularly between whites and African Americans, whites and Latinos, are even larger than they are for the average household, suggesting that we're baking inequality in to the next generation in terms of disparities. There's also significant geographic disparities within the state. This is how real median household income has behaved between 1994 and 1998, before we went into a recession then, and 2014, 2018, before we're heading into the recession now. And you can see here that while income has grown in the coastal communities, particularly up in San Jose and the East, San Francisco and the East Bay, and in San Diego, a little bit up in LA and Orange, that it's actually plunged in places like Bakersfield and Fresno. The state has become more separate and distant over time. We've also really outpaced the rest of the country in terms of over-incarceration. And while we have begun the de-incarceration, you can see here the state prison population, the lighter line is California. We've begun de-incarcerating since about 2008, 2009, mostly as a result of legal action, and then eventually as a result of voter action with Proposition 47 and a number of other things. We have a number of people who are now re-entering the labor force, and they're about to be hit by one of the most significant economic crises of any generation, making it even harder to re-enter into the labor market. And then finally, we're a state which has got roughly 1/4 of the nation's undocumented immigrants. And when we look at Los Angeles in particular, nearly 19% of LA County is either undocumented or living with an undocumented family member. And while undocumented workers were 12% of LA County's employed labor force at the beginning of this crisis, they are mostly being left out of the relief measures. They don't have access to unemployment insurance, and the federal relief checks, the $1,200 checks that are going and $2,400 for a couple and $500 for a kid that are going to families, those do not go to undocumented immigrants who file taxes with an individual taxpayer identification number, an ITIN. And indeed, if you jointly filed with someone who is a U.S. citizen spouse or a lawful permanent resident spouse, but you jointly filed with that person, they've got a social security number, you've got an ITIN, that entire family is frozen out of that relief check that's coming from the federal government. So we've got tremendous disconnection in California at the same time that we've got sort of queued up politics to be able to do something about it. And that's something that we were thinking about a couple of years ago, in which we wrote a report, which Chris will now talk about.
So with that background of California's history and social divide as context, and after the 2016 election, recognizing that we couldn't look to Washington for help, we started working with a whole coalition of progressive organizations and others in California to try and figure out how we could move from that past to a future that would promote innovation and inclusion for all. And through a series of focus groups and discussions and looking at different policies, we came up with a 12-step program. And that 12-step program fleshed out policies in a whole series of different areas around innovation and economic development, around the caring economy, around education, around de-incarceration, around embracing immigrant California. And, you know, it was an effort to try and create a unified set of policies that could move California forward. And, you know, I think it was a useful exercise, but one of the things that emerged out of that as we shared it with our partners in this project was a sense that we needed a stronger unifying vision, something that could link this together in a way that would provide a stronger vision and a stronger sort of unifying effort that could pull that together. And so that's what we're in the midst of now, and why we're so excited to be working with you this morning and really looking to get your feedback on trying to develop this notion of solidarity economics. It's an approach. There's a website there that's set up and is linked from the PowerPoint, and we'll make sure that you get copies of the PowerPoint. But the project is really designed to pull together this idea of solidarity economics and center race, place, and power in that context to help understand the possibility of building alternatives in our state, shifting institutions, and using that as a model for change at a national level. And so I want to talk through some examples of how that notion of solidarity can play out in different arenas as we think about the economy. And the first place is to recognize that our standard economic narrative and theory starts from a theory that people act in their self-interest and that value can be captured simply in prices. And that's clearly happening in market. But ironically, it actually is embedded in much of our state functions too, where the role of the state is seen as regulating or taming the problematic natures of self-interest in the market. But we also know that people act out of solidarity and mutuality, and that is true in the best businesses and most of our neighborhoods and communities and civil society. And so how can we build on that fundamental insight that people also act out of solidarity and mutuality to create a better economy? Now, one thing that we have learned over the last decades and decades, as Michelle said, we've been working together, is recognizing that those places, both regions in the US and it turns out nations around the globe that are more equitable grow faster, that inequality is a real drag on economic growth. and that those places that are successful in linking equity and economic growth seem to have a set of dialogues and processes and information and knowledge sharing, what we call epistemic communities that pull together particularly dynamic and diverse constituencies who recognize common roots together, are building relationships and overcoming difference through those commitment to that relationship, and using reason and facts, not ideology, to overcome those differences. But we also recognize that at the core driving sectors of our new economy and the economy going forward, collective values, collective resources, and collective engagement is a critical part of our economic vibrancy. And that's true whether it's in terms of technological developments. If you look at the iPhone, most of the technologies in the iPhone have their roots in publicly supported research and development and innovation. And we all know about the ways that our data becomes a source of value in the economy overall. But social connections and solidarity is also an important part of the caring economy. And we see that so clearly now in the pandemic crisis and caring for our elderly population, but it's also true in childcare and home health care services. And if you look at that chart on the right, the blue line there is employment in all high-tech services, which is actually less than total employment in caring services. And so we need to be also thinking about caring economy as a critical part of going forward. So we also think about solidarity in the context of social policy. People often talk about a safety net, but we're trying to think about how do we frame that as a social wage where people are getting part of their compensation for being productive members of society in terms of having access to education, to health care, to a guaranteed minimum income as a human right, something that we all benefit from our social role and connection to the economy as a whole. And in that context of recognizing these as a human right, we also recognize they're contributing to economic development and economic growth, and it's part of the reward for that contribution of getting a social wage. One of the clear examples of that, and just an application of solidarity in a particular arena, is in the area of housing, where it's very clear from some of the international experience, and one of the most dramatic places that has happened is both Hong Kong and Singapore, where investments in public housing, and in Hong Kong it's nearly half the population, in Singapore it's over 90% of the population that live in publicly subsidized housing, has been a critical contribution from them moving from being really poor third world countries in the 1960s to now having a higher standard of living than we do today. And there are studies that point to the ways that our lack of access to housing and housing affordability in California is actually a major drag on economic growth countrywide. It's also important to think about solidarity with the environment broadly. And when we neglect the environment, of course, we have climate change and the tremendous economic costs associated with the disasters that are associated with that. But it's also true in our cities and in our very day-to-day lives. And again, we see that with the increasing evidence of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. And of course, part of that is that the air quality contributes to worse respiratory diseases and asthma and makes people more vulnerable to the virus. And so really thinking about how do we have solidarity with the environment where we live, work, and play is a critical part of the framework that we're trying to develop in this solidarity economics framing. But we know this isn't going to come from good ideas alone. That's why I want to turn it back to Manuel to talk about what else we have to be linking with, as well as the good ideas that are emerging from our work with all our partners on this.
Great. So a couple of things to close up with this is that, as Chris said, we're pretty aware that research does not always win the day. We knew that raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would not cause unemployment and would be beneficial to working people. We knew that from the research decades before it was put into action. And it was put into action really by organizing around Fight for 15. We knew that there were environmental disparities that were causing vulnerability didn't really get recognized in the state of California until groups like that came together, the California Environmental Justice Alliance, essentially forced policy change. We knew that deincarceration was bad for communities and bad for the economy. We didn't really launch into deincarceration until there was community and social struggle to do it. We knew that immigrants contribute to the California economy. We didn't really get the kinds of policies that have made immigrant life more bearable in the state of California until there was fantastic immigrant rights organizing to make that possible. So in that sense, solidarity economics means trying to think about the impulses to solidarity that are there within people. It does mean also thinking about the policies that encourage our sort of interconnection and solidarity, but it also means thinking about solidarity as a vehicle for political struggle to actually put these changes into place. So we believe that we need to lift up high road businesses that do a better job, and some are doing very well in this crisis about trying to take care of their employees, trying to make sure there aren't layoffs. We do think that it's important to stress empathy, the idea of connecting with other people, and the idea of norms. What is the way that we're supposed to behave with one another as responsible business people, as responsible civic leaders, as responsible movement leaders? All of that is key, building that sense of belonging and connection, but it's not enough. We need to also be tackling concentrated wealth and power. We need to be challenging racism, particularly anti-Black racism, and other forms of domination that have allowed us to have such a high level of social distance. And we need to be practicing solidarity in our daily lives and building the kind of movements that will change the terrain of power to make the kind of policies we're talking about actually part of everyday practice. So this solidarity economics framework is an economics of mutuality, and we think it's a new framework for our economy. What we hope we've done actually in just this quick 20-minute presentation is almost never say the economy. Because when you say the economy, it feels like it's a set of rules out there that are natural, they're sort of come from God or come from nature, and they really can't be changed. We make our economy with the rules that we put in place and with the ways that we behave with one another. And we think that the framework for moving forward is very similar, with some alterations I'll talk about in a second, to what was the passage out of the Great Depression. The passage out of the Great Depression was to put together the idea of growing, connecting, and securing. How could you grow the economy again? And that involved Keynesian demand expansion. How could you connect communities? That was the Tennessee Valley Authority, bringing in those geographically left behind communities into the economic mainstream. And how do you provide security, the Social Security Act, unemployment insurance, and all of the innovations that occurred during the Great Depression? That's a kind of basic template, but we know it's not enough. Because while we want to grow, we can no longer grow at the cost of the environment. And so we need to figure out what it means to also have solidarity with the planet. We know that there was some element of connecting, but also that the New Deal was fundamentally racist in its design and its application, in terms of leaving out domestic workers, leaving out agricultural workers who are largely African American, Latino, and even when things were implemented, like the GI Bill, it was given to local control and therefore done in a racist way, particularly in the South of the United States. So we cannot replicate that racist reconstruction. And we also know that security in the post-war period became largely attached to whether or not you were employed. And now security needs to be attached largely to whether or not simply you exist. And that means we need to make sure that it's at a state level. Most fundamentally, the thing that we'd like to leave you with is an idea that we actually heard from someone else. Most of our good ideas actually occur when we listen to social movement leaders and community organizers. And just the other day on a call, a community organizer said, you know, we don't really want a recovery, we want a rebuilding. Because we don't want to go back to the sickness that we had before. We want to create a different kind of economy, a solidarity economy where everyone counts, where everyone can participate, and where everyone is rewarded for their contributions and their efforts. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing, and I think I turn things back over to Michelle.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Pastor and Dr. Benner. I just wanted to share this screen really quickly. Give me a moment. There's my button. So that you all can see, again, shameless plug. They are fantastic authors. I mean it when I say they have been building on this body of work and the case studies they've done around the country, you know, for many, many years. So if you haven't had an opportunity to, you know, dig into some reading since we're all on lockdown, this is a perfect time to do it. Just go ahead over to Amazon. There's this next one. This one's specific to California. For those of you who want to, you know, see what's going on in California, Dr. Pastor's one of his most recent books is The State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Means for America's Future. So thank you both so much for that. Deeply appreciate you and your leadership. And your guidance. And, you know, today's dialogues later on in just a short minute after these two very fast pitches will really be about, you know, how do we apply this, right? How do we take solidarity economics back home to our sectors and to our workplaces and to our lives? So I'm looking forward to that in just a few minutes. But to begin, let's go past. Thank you, Dr. Benner. Veronica Flores, who you met just a little while ago, is going to give her fast pitch, Finance for the Many. So Veronica, I'm going to turn this over to you. You have 10 minutes. Our timekeeper will ping you so that you can stay on time. And please, tell us your plan.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I have to say before, I know you keep hearing that, I'm sure with all the stuff that you've been on, I keep having issues with my internet. So let me now share my screen. Hold on, I'm having a hard time with this. Hold on 1 second. Okay, can everybody see? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. You're good to go.
All right, great. Well, for those of you who were part of the presentation or part of the launch of CORE in September, one of the things that I talked about then was the idea of debt and how we need to think about debt in this country. This country is run by debt. And so, but what does that look like if we're talking about social impact? So when we think about what that looks like today, there are a couple of different debts. So what I'm going to focus on is particularly around consumer debt. So consumer debt is owned by individuals, right? They are owned by a bank, a credit union, and usually is different purchases. It could be that people are buying a home, people are having medical debt, it could be student debt, it could be just the credit card debt that comes as a result of that. So we separate those into revolving consumer debt and non-revolving consumer debt. Revolving consumer debt is actually quite large in this country. And so right now we have consumer debt that is in the trillions, and it continues to grow. Now, this was in 2019. This is the most recent data. But as you know, given what we're experiencing right now, this is going to surmount this, whatever the estimations were, as we've been doing from 2018 per quarter of 2019. So now we're looking at if there's been an increase of 3.8% increase in debt between 2018 and 2019, we can most likely see that as doubling in 2020. So right now, this has changed a lot of my presentation. You know, we were looking at, as John stated from the very beginning, we were talking about recession last year, but the reality is we were speculating that we would be in recession. We are in recession. And so what does that look like in our communities is what I need to be talking about today, and what we should be thinking about in terms of the opportunity, right? So what does that debt look like? The highest debt in this country continues to be student debt. In fact, 126%, and that is all very color. So when we think about who carries the debt, 80% of that is carried by Latinos. 71% of those are Mexican. 78% of the people of color who carry that are Black. And 76% of those are African American that are not homeowners. So when we think about the debt in this country and what that could benefit, whether it could benefit a community or could not, in fact, it's making it worse. So the most recent stats, when we look at where is debt mounting, and in the past, when my parents' time, the debt that you see at the very bottom, the light blue, that's mortgage. That would have been a higher debt in most families. Now the highest debt continues to be student debt, and that's rising. And so when the speculation was that we would be in a recession by maybe 2020, maybe 2021 or 22, we were looking at what that would look like to get to recession. Now we're already there. So who carries most of this debt in this country? 80% of it is carried by the 80% of the population. And that is mostly what they call the bottom 80%. So what does that look like for us? Well, should we be worried about this, right? Yes, we should be very worried about this, because this is what happened when we first came into this crisis of the pandemic. This is the statement that people were showing. Wow, the majority of people don't even have $500 in the bank to deal with this emergency. This is why we're seeing the disparities and the lines and lines of people trying to get food. This is why, right? This is why we're struggling or advocating for rent control, rent management, mortgage management. So when we think about who those most are at risk, we think about youth, we think about the elder, we think about families, poor families, middle-income families. And so now we also have to think about all of these people that are planning on retirement. That is, once again, we go back to the Great Recession, that is now also at risk, which means a higher burden in our communities, a higher burden in our system, in our GDP. So and again, these are all numbers at this point. So most Americans are spending were spending 25% of their paycheck every month just to make ends meet. But the other day I was watching PBS NewsHour, and this was something that came on TV. That's why it looks like that. And by the time the pandemic is over, half of the world's population could be living in poverty. So this is now a global issue. But what does that look like? Let's look at the positive side of this and the opportunity that we're here. In solidarity economics, and this is the part that I feel completely agree with what Manuel and Chris were saying, we have an opportunity for transformation. We have an opportunity for revolution right now. This doesn't come to our doorstep every day. So what would that look like? So let's look at debt for a minute. As I said, majority of the debt is actually being carried by Black and brown folks. But carrying debt also has a huge impact on everybody else as part of the economy. They can't buy a home. They can't save money. Banks don't have as much cash flow from our communities. So there's a huge impact on the community about that. But we also know that there's been studies, and I think this is actually the same thing that Chris and Manuel were talking about. There are studies that demonstrate that by having macroeconomic effects can have on canceling part of the debt. So if we start to look at what are the strategies to canceling debt, we can understand that in fact, they're going to have really short-term and long-term impacts on the GDP, on overall improvement in our economy. So one grows, everybody else grows. So when we think about the economic downturn and consumer spending, well, we keep hearing about this country's run by consumer spending is down. So therefore, everything closes, we have job losses. But we also know that if there were good products in place that would support bankruptcy, that would support debt relief, that would support employment, I mean, we just found out this morning that in fact, or yesterday actually, that the PPP, the SBA loan that was being offered, the system has crashed, the money's run out already, and hardly anybody got into the system. So it's that, where are the systems in our government to be able to support this and understand that by having effective relief, by having effective products online, we could actually improve the economy for everyone. So debt relief plays an important role in stabilizing the economy. And there's lots of studies that demonstrate this. So what does that look like for us? Well, you know, it definitely, we know that by studies show that it can improve the economy overall, and that unemployment can go up by 2% if we don't begin to do that. Our unemployment is way past that already, given this crisis. But we have an opportunity to look at this. So what would that look like? Well, there are lots of different ways that people look for debt relief. Right now, really, all I want to do is, focus on debt management. There's an opportunity for us here as practitioners, as and I'm going to call it practitioners, and then within that, I'm going to incorporate philanthropy, social impact investors, nonprofits, activists. So when we think about debt management, that's really about how do we take care of debt in a way that makes it doable for consumers. So, and there are a couple of different ways. One is whether there's debt management or debt settlement. Debt settlement obviously is something that people apply for that. You know, you can cancel someone's debt, and then we can look at the impact of that. But the opportunity here for social enterprising, for big thinking, is debt management. So debt management, it's something that offers structured plans so that it can help people pay their debt, people can save money, it can also really impact their credit score. So there are ways in which a number of sectors come together to pull this. Now, when we think about the opportunity, well, we know that we have to think about entrepreneurship in this way. We have to think about social enterprising. So what is the social impact of thinking of debt, right? So these two areas are the areas that can really help us think through an opportunity. Social enterprising, for those that may not be aware of it, is just really a business that allows us to produce revenue while producing social impact. And there are different ways to do that. B Corps, social enterprises, there are a number of ways to do that. So the vehicle itself is something that I'm going to put out on a little side note here, because we're going to talk about it at the very end. So for us, I want to focus on debt buyers.
Veronica?
Yes.
Just really quickly wanted to let you know you're a bit over time, so we got to get you to wind us up to your grand finale.
Oh, sorry about that, you guys. Thank you. Okay, so debt buying. So when we look at debt buying, this is the opportunity. What does that look like? There are markets. This is called a secondary market. We can purchase debt for 4 cents on the dollar in many cases, and we can compile it. We can aggregate debt. And in many times, this is called zombie debt. And so there's lots of different opportunities. I think I'm happy to have this conversation. We are already in conversations with an investor group. We are in conversations with our attorneys so that we can really think about this as a very large opportunity for us to do this. We can end debt in this country and people can make money. Impact investment is one of those huge opportunities. As you can see, I mean, a lot of folks are jumping into the space because it is profitable, because it does produce social impact. So I would love to hear for those of you that are interested in being part of this gig, because we're going to kick it off. And but I would like to have different segments of our finance and our philanthropic and our impact investors out there who want to be part of this. Because you know what? If nothing changes, nothing changes. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Veronica. Appreciate it. And so we're going to be moving right along here. very quickly to Matthew Haas, is going to give his presentation. Matt, appreciate you. He's been on board with us from the beginning. The show is yours. Matt, we can't hear you in case you're talking.
Sorry, I'm
There we go.
trying to share my screen. Hold on. So thank you, everybody, for sitting here and spending some time listening to each of these respective presenters. I'm going to discuss here the idea and the notion of corporate behavior and building a resilient economy, the intention and the impact and the outcome. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the ways I've done this is to start from the point of my own reference. I'm a Jewish white male. I'm privileged to have had a good education, a strong network, and a secure job. I'm married to an amazing partner, a psychiatrist. I have 2 teenage kids doing online school in a pandemic. I live in a single-family home, and actually right now in my backyard. I also want to caveat that what I'm saying here is not my company's position. This is solely my own. So what you see in the second slide is my particular approach to the way I look at the framework or my mind mapping as we look at how do you build a coalition for economic resilience. And I start here with the first pink slide, which is the roles, and I go clockwise. I look at the roles that I have and the roles we all have. Then I look at the power paradigm. I look at the attributes. I look at the implied biases. I look at it where we are in conscious capital and the solidarity that we want to form. And what I see here is the outer circles intersect and grow into each other depending upon how much reciprocity exists between and amongst all the players and all these different areas. The next slide is about our perceptions of economic roles. Places, spaces, places, and laces. Start out again from my point of reference. I'm a very privileged person. I grew up in a very supportive family, promoted my education. I've had an amazing number of peers and mentors in my career. I have an amazing, strong network. But many people don't have that ability. And as we've heard from Dr. Pastor and others, social determinants of health are a real challenge. Health and well-being are more determined by zip codes than they are by the genetic code. The second thing we need to think about here is gender. A lot of roles here are important to understand, male and female, the quality and the equality we want to do in respect to women and women's equality. And finally, home and work. We're all living now and working from our own home. So what I want to understand here and what I'm talking about here is the idea of what does the home environment mean and what does your work environment mean? And I always look at it in 3 ways. The self, what am I in my job doing and how do I approach this perception of spaces, places, and laces? Second, my family, my wife and my children. What are the values I'm trying to inculcate them? And then finally, my social interactions. How and in what way do I lift and be an upstander and not a bystander? The next slide is about existing power paradigms. What's really important to understand here, and what I think we all acknowledge, is that women and minorities are not necessarily well represented. In fact, in some instances, not at all represented. If you look at healthcare here in California and specifically in LA, USC, UCLA, Providence, St. Joseph, Adventist, and Cedars-Sinai, healthcare institutions are all run by men. At the end of the day, when you look at faith, there's been progress in faith. Places of worship, priests, rabbis, women have started to come into the workforce, into that particular space, but it's important to acknowledge that that's a very big power paradigm. The third, capital. When you look at the 3 largest banks, or 4 largest banks that are here in California, Wells Fargo, Union Bank, City National Bank, and CIT, they're all run by men again. And finally, when you look at technology and the media, Netflix, Google, Disney, Facebook, Again, men at the head. In fact, if you look at venture capital in the last 10 years, all these companies were getting unicorn money. Most of the venture capital was primarily supporting men, not women, in this space. So it's very important to understand women and minorities have not had representation in many of these areas. The next notion is the underlying dominant attributes, the characteristics and actions. We all understand that when you become a citizen, you move to this country, you're taking an oath. People are coming here to establish themselves in the American dream. But what does the American dream really mean? If you go back to our history, Native Americans were taken from their tribes, their children, and put into institutions to essentially become and acculturate and assimilate into America and the American value. Even currently, there's a woman who was in high school, a young teenager in high school, who was told she had to cut her dreadlocks in order to graduate. This is phenomenal that this is still occurring today in our society. Finally, the idea and notion that we all need to dress for success, but do we take into account who these people are? Does everybody need to show up in a suit and tie? And how does the media represent these dominant attributes? Finally, the next slide is about underlying narratives. On the upper right-hand corner is primarily where I have professionally developed and done my career for the last 30 years. Community development, economic development. But a lot of that upper right-hand corner, two sides of the equation, has been in the left-hand side. It's about victims. It's about addressing people as less than. It's about saving them. It's about looking at how we can come in and provide solutions to their problems, as opposed to looking at these communities as having assets. How do we build up their potentials and their possibilities? How do we provide those inside-out opportunities? If you also go to the left-hand side, when we think about algorithms have biases that exist already in the current system. There are real-world biases. They translate into data biases and business biases that lead to algorithmic biases. So we have to understand that there are biases that we are not cognitively as well as informed of, that already exist. Also, at the same time, there's the precariat gig worker. Are we all just becoming a barcode minion to what we do in our own lives? And finally, what is the colonization? How does the colonization of resources happen? If you guys all remember, in 2017, we got a tax cut. Companies said, we will address and give bonuses and increase pay to the workers and start aligning our mission with the worker. Come 2020, we have a pandemic. Understand there's no control over the pandemic, but now you've got massive layoffs and furloughs.
Matt, I just want to let you know that you're down to 2 minutes, so that way you have time to get us to your punchline. Yep.
The next slide here is the idea of reshaping the framework. I think this is important, again, going back to my particular area of my social endeavor and community development. What I've really been involved in most importantly is, how do we build a framework for reciprocity and resilience? We need to understand who has a seat at the table. Sorry, I didn't go to the next slide. Who has a seat at the table? Are we taking into account the end user? In these two areas, social capital formation and physical capital formation are two ways I've seen the conversation evolve in the last 10 years. But are we just reorganizing, recasting, reshaping still the same assumption around social impact bonds, opportunity zones? And when you do physical formations under public housing and Hope 6 and under Promise and Choice neighborhoods. Finally, in closing, what I think we really need to start thinking about here is a solidarity solution. We need to solve reciprocity and resilience in the corporate suite. We need to move towards a mutuality that Dr. Pastor was talking about. Mutual caring and support, understanding in public and private lives, and there's 5 ways that we can do that. One is, the person who is a diversity, equity, inclusion officer can't just be a token individual, cannot just exist in marketing and branding or in HR. Second, That person has to have the seat at the table. It has to be in the boardroom. Third, there needs to be a return to reciprocity, making this role and its impact part of shareholder values. Fourth, we need to create a framework for long-term goals, 3, 5, 7, and 10 years, not just quarter to quarter in dividends. And finally, we have to understand what the nuance is between advocating and lobbying for the common good, from the workers to the senior management, to the board, to the shareholders. So in summary, corporate behavior building a resilient economy needs to understand that there is a race, place, and power paradigm, as Dr. Benner was talking about. And let us hope that in this recession, we don't lead to regression and repression. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. Really, really appreciate you. As you can tell, folks, these presentations are really coming from, people's heart and from, the areas that they really feel we can have the most impact in building a new framework, for our economy, much in the vein of Dr. Benner and Dr. Pastor's 12-step program. I love that they mentioned it's a 12-step, but they haven't yet told us what we're addicted to. They told us all the good things that we should be doing. I have my own assumptions about what maybe we're addicted to, but I'll leave that to all of you to determine what that is. So next we're going to go into our
Actually, Michelle, we're pretty clear. We think we're addicted to inequality, racism, and short-term thinking.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, that was my fault for not making that explicit in that slide, but that's definitely it.
So, but the first step is admitting you have a problem.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you. And I always like to use the C word. I think we're addicted to capitalism. Hold
Yes,
your ear.
we are.
So, but we can save capitalism. I know a lot of folks would like to do that. We can reshape it into a solidarity economic framework, which is why we're all here. So next we're going to experience Zoom rooms. If you have not been in breakout sessions on Zoom, today is the day, people. You get to add this to your resume, all right? So Lauren is going to break us out, and Dr. Pastor and Dr. Benner, can you take a moment before, Lauren, you do that and tell folks again, what are we going to be talking about in our Zoom rooms?
So what we're hoping in this Zoom room is to have you reflect a little bit about how these concepts of solidarity economics and all the things we've talked about resonate with your own personal experience. So it's not so much about what you intend to do in your work lives and professional lives, but really sort of how does it resonate with your own values, your own experience in life. And as part of that, tell us what's missing, what did we get wrong or need to include that's not there, what resonated with your own experience, what was new, and then thinking a bit about, as you think about these ideas, how does this concept of solidarity economics impact your leadership? And we have facilitators in all of the rooms who will help facilitate the conversations and note takers. And we're really, really interested in your genuine, honest feedback. So tell us the things you don't like, because that makes us smarter. We prefer that, although if there's things you like too, you can tell us that as well.
All right, Lauren, I think we're ready.
Great. So I will put you in your breakout rooms. I mentioned it once earlier before, but I'll mention it again. If you are connected by phone, you may get kicked out of the meeting. Just reconnect, let me know, and I'll put you in a breakout room. So just let me know if you have any issues, but I'll be moving you all now.
Back, everyone. Welcome back. Unbeknownst to you, we have a cheat sheet in the Google Drive that Dr. Pastor and Dr. Benner and some of us are able to observe the facilitators taking notes during your conversation. So we really did get to virtually walk around and listen in to your different Zoom room conversations via that Google document. So a lot of, there were some themes for sure. And so
Thank you all.
Okay, Dr. Pastor and Dr. Benner are actually going to take some time to reflect on what they heard and on some of the things that you guys were talking about in your Zoom rooms.
So I'm going to lift up 3 things that I heard or read, I should say, as I scrolled through the notes that the facilitators were taking. And there are many others. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff, a lot of interest in debt, particularly student debt, the racial wealth gap. We're going to hear a little bit more about that when we hear from Ann Price. But let me lift up sort of three things that I think are key. One is that there was, and this makes a lot of sense, we were trying to give a kind of 20-minute overview. There was a lot of interest in what those 12 steps were and sort of what specific strategies might be that come from it. We do encourage you to take a look at that. At the end of this session, we will be sending out links to the PowerPoints and also links to those documents. But in that 12-step program, we did call for universal basic income, something that would have been good then in 2018, certainly would have been good in this crisis, and would be good going forward. We framed it as a data dividend, a return to public investment in the innovation infrastructure, and also the fact that these data companies benefit from our data. We called for full immigrant integration, something that would have been good in 2018, certainly would be good now in a public health crisis, good in the future to not leave out undocumented Californians, more than 2/3 of whom have lived in the country for a decade or longer, called for rapid de-incarceration. We talked about a couple things that I think are also really interesting in the current crisis that aren't being talked about. How to use the Industrial Welfare Commission to constitute wage boards in sectors that are not unionized so that employers and employees could get together and talk about the sector and how the sector could move forward. That's going to be incredibly important in sort of reopening parts of the economy. So there is a lot of specificity in those 12 steps that will that actually do have a lot of applications to the current era. So I encourage you to look there, but we were aware that we need to have a more of a conversation about specifics. Second big thing that came up is about solidarity economics as a frame and the way that it resonates with a number of different people. And I would say that there's sort of three things there within that are important to lift up. One is that it's not about going back to where we were before, because where we were before was sick, and if we really want to repair the sickness that made us vulnerable to a disease, we actually need to just construct a very different kind of economy. Second, that it's fundamentally about solidarity and mutuality. That seemed to resonate with people and how we connect. And third, that it's about empathy, norms, and power. I was really struck by Matt's presentation about how it is that businesses can adopt this internally, and how do we then make sure also that we've got the discipline of community-based organizations and social movement organizations kind of pushing business to do the right thing, but also recognizing that there's a role for high-road businesses, which we were trying to lift up. The third thing, and we didn't talk a lot about this, but it's popping through in some of the comments, is fundamentally to reconnect, we need to heal. We need to heal the social disconnections that have become vibrant and endemic in their sickness in our society. And certainly after we pass through this crisis, we're going to need to heal from the emotional damage that it has caused to people who are living in fear, who have been going to work even though they're fearful because that's what they need to be able to survive. We're going to need to make sure that what the physical distancing we're practicing is not about fearing other people, but the reason that we're doing that is out of caring for other people. But there's going to be enormous emotional damage. And one of the things that we're going to need to do, those of us who are sort of more secular, think more about the economy, et cetera, is to think about the kind of issues of healing and trauma that have been caused by this crisis. But going back to the point before, we're caused every day by the kind of society we live in that signals to people by putting hazards in their neighborhoods, by having inadequate health care, by paying wages that are not decent, by not having respect for the work that people do, for not fully understanding the pain and dislocation of incarceration or of being undocumented, or not really fully incorporating disabled folks into what it is we say are valued lives that are contributing. That kind of pain, trauma, dislocation, that's been endemic in our society. So as we heal this kind of immediate trauma from the crisis, how do we address the underlying traumas that have been put in place by our social structure. Chris, what did you hear?
So Manuel was trying to look across all of the groups, and I was going deep into one group. So I want to share two things that came out, well, three things. One was that what we talked about resonated in some important ways, and particularly lifting up, Manuel, the way of talking about the New Deal was actually really racist in its implementation. We need to recognize that and make sure we're not going back to a false narrative about that. Second thing about what's missing and we need to be smarter about is what about questioning growth itself, right? And how do we think about that whole notion of growth, of driving our decision making? And I think part of what we tried to do in that first report, and I think we could do better about, is that we need to get much more detailed metrics around genuine progress, well-being, and improved well-being rather than growth. And I think trying to get away from this notion of growth to be more complex around that. And finally, and this will sort of help tee up Anne's talk, was an emphasis on wealth creation and addressing the racial wealth gap and thinking about intergenerational wealth, but particularly thinking about in the context of capital and access for businesses owned by people of color. And how do we make sure that capital markets and investment are addressing that, and particularly looking at the risk that's involved in trying to grow new businesses, and how do we address those factors. So great discussion, really appreciate all the input. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to, is it Jocelyn who's gonna introduce our keynote speaker?
Yeah, so I just want to recognize Ms. Jocelyn Cousins, who is the district manager for the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. For those of you who joined us back in September, they were our gracious hosts and partners. They remain our partners, and so we're super excited that Jocelyn is with us today. We're planning an event in the fall as well that is tentatively, at the Federal Reserve. If not, we'll have a virtual Federal Reserve. We're going to get a backdrop with a big vault.
Yes, right. A big picture of a lot of money or something, right?
That's it. I'm sure Manuel can hook us up. He's got it all figured out.
Yes. Oh, great. Well,
thank you
so much, Michelle, and good morning, everybody. And as Michelle said, it's unfortunate that we couldn't be at the branch today because we love hosting the group, but I'm optimistic. We're all going to be very optimistic that later this year, if it's safe, we'll be able to host you all again. But I'm really excited about the commitment of this group, and that we're still coming together virtually to share ideas and strategies for economic resilience. So the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco covers the 9 western states across the country. And I'm the district manager for the area, and I'm honored to support you all, leaders across in this area and change makers within community health councils, LA Care Health Plan, and of course, Doctors Pastor and Benner. And I have the pleasure and am honored to introduce our keynote speaker for today. So Ann Price is currently president of the Insight Center for Community Economic Development and has spent over 20 years working in the public sector on issues including child welfare, hunger, welfare reform, workforce development, community development, and higher education. Since 2011, Ann has led the Closing the Racial Wealth Gap initiative at the Insight Center, elevating the voices and opinions of experts of color in national economic debates and policy making. Her tireless work has brought the issue of the racial wealth gap into mainstream consciousness and vernacular, with an explosion of media coverage of the data and research quantifying racial differences in wealth accumulation. Thank you, Ann, for your leadership and for joining us today. And I'll turn it over to Ann.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for that introduction. And I do want to thank the Federal Reserve. I think you're a really great Federal Reserve in this country that's really pushed out some of the most kind of interesting and progressive work around wealth, and so glad to partner with you. I am going to get ready to share my screen with you, but I want to just kind of really hone in on a couple of things. One, I really want to just preface my remarks by really saying that we have to really think about addressing the structures of our economy, those structures that have excluded and extracted wealth from people of color, and really look at what the root drivers are. And so in my very short talk, I really want to talk about those root drivers because I do believe that they can provide a mechanism to help show how we're connected and help us find and identify vehicles for building solidarity. And so I really want to kind of overlay that with the conversation today. So I am going to hopefully be able to pull up my presentation. I hope that I can do this here.
Your presentation was showing.
Was it? Okay.
So just bring it up.
Is it showing now? I can't tell.
Then yes, it is.
Does it
Now
show
here where it says slideshow on your it's slideshow. No, up in the actual PowerPoint itself.
Oh, okay. Great. Oops.
And then from beginning, and it should show that screen. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Manuel. So I just want to start, and this is not going to be a data-laden kind of conversation, but it's really important to kind of start with an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about the racial wealth gap, because sometimes we conflate income with wealth, and understanding that wealth is kind of everything you own minus all your debt, that it's a financial marker, but it also is a marker for something much bigger. Wealth allows us to be able to weather a storm, a catastrophe like the one we're experiencing right now. It allows us to kind of retire with dignity, to help us live out our dreams, like starting a business, allows us to educate our children. It gives us greater freedom, right? And so when I'm talking about wealth, that's what I'm talking about. When we talk about the racial wealth gap, and a lot of times, we really, the racial wealth gap has been really part of our mainstream vernacular for a while, and that we're going to close this gap. I really want to emphasize how big this gap really is, right? So these claims of all these things that we can do to close the gap, one or two policies that will do that, really don't give us a sense of the magnitude of this gap. Right, so this graph is really showing that magnitude, that this is a really large gap. We're not talking about $5,000 or $10,000. We're talking about in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so when we think about really going after this issue, we've got to think that this is a large chasm, right? I want to give you a sense of what that looks like here in California. So one of the things, just right off the bat, we don't have a lot of great data on wealth. We just don't have this at the local level like we need it. We don't have disaggregated data in the way that we need to really understand kind of who's excluded from our economy. We've been able to do some studies. I've worked with some economists who've been able to do that, and we're lucky in California that we had a partner like the Federal Reserve to help us look at this. So the issue of race, place, and power that Manuel talked about is so essential when we talk about wealth, because it really shows us what that looks like. So I'll tell you, in LA, for example, you could really see that there is huge differences when we start to disaggregate this data. And we really don't have really great data that disaggregates Asian Pacific Islander populations, Latinx populations, and even for that matter, different groups of Black populations. And so we were able to do, and I was able to partner with UCLA and Duke and the New School to release this data a few years ago. And so I'm showing this to say that even our ideas about who has wealth and who doesn't is really sometimes distorted, right? So even looking at this really tells you the huge differences in wealth, even amongst people of color, even within a demographic group. The one thing I will say about this is that no matter really where we look at data on wealth, and there's a paucity of data, the two groups that really fall at the bottom are Black and Latinx groups all across the country, and there's totally different Latinx makeup across the country, but we still see the same pattern over and over again. And that's a tremendous difference in wealth, really low levels of wealth. Even in LA, we were surprised, and even the Korean community was surprised at how low their wealth levels were, based on what we know in terms of business ownership there. So this is just to reiterate the point that race and place and power matter, and it really matters when you start to disaggregate this and look at how people really got their wealth and where it came from. I want to make this point about how wealth is really accumulated, because I think it's really important to really understand that basically we get wealth because it's passed down to us. And it's passed down not usually by an inheritance, but by opportunities that people already have and how they can build wealth through a number of mechanisms, right? And so what we're learning is that, you know, where you're kind of born, the family you're born in, really plays a big role in the wealth holdings you'll have later in life. And this graph basically just says that, you know, it's really important for children to come into the world with parents that have some kind of asset. It really is a predetermining factor for opportunity. So just really want to reiterate that point around that wealth is intergenerational. Some of the remarks I'm going to make, I'm not going to go through this with a lot of detail, come out of a recent piece that I wrote called Don't Fixate on the Racial Wealth Gap, Focus on Undoing Its Root Causes. I'm just putting that up there because if you really want to dig in more, there's more in that paper that was done out of the Roosevelt Institute and Insight. And so I'm going to draw from those remarks today. I think the biggest thing that I can say about understanding wealth is really examining what are the rules underneath our economic decisions that mean that some people can reap the benefits of our economic decisions and some people are excluded from them and some people are predicated on, right? And so one of the ways that I think we can really start to think about the racial wealth gap, differently than what we've done, is to focus on how wealth is accumulated and focus on the issue of plunder, right? And it might sound kind of dire, but I really think in thinking about how we can build solidarity, right? How we can understand how we're actually connected together in different communities will come from really understanding the issue of plunder. And what I mean by that is how actually our economic decisions work to take and extract and exploit wealth for people of color, and how that impacts all communities, who benefits and who's excluded. And so it's somewhat of a different way of thinking about this. It certainly gets in some of the issues that were talked about before around debt, right? And how debt mechanisms really, really work. And we think about bank garnishments and wage garnishments and why these mechanisms even exist. Why are primarily Black and Latinx folks experiencing these levels of debt? It's not an accident. As Manuel said, this is not natural. It didn't just happen. This was by design, right? So when I think about really kind of the economic structures and rules of our economy, we're talking about capitalism, I totally agree with this premise that we can't just look at growth as a measure, right? We just can't look at that as a measure of well-being. But we certainly can think about how neoliberal policies have affected racial wealth inequality. So what do I mean by that? I'm really talking about the way that we make decisions that basically put the market first, that put market outcomes first over people, right? And those decisions that basically say, let's let the market do what it's going to do, and whatever it's going to do is going to work out for people, that it's going to be fair, and it's going to be inclusive, right? And this kind of ideology that's existed for so long is, in my mind and many others, an economic failure, but it is a very much of a political success. Because what it's done is basically said that if you are poor, if you lack wealth, it's really your own doing. It's about the decisions that you make. It's about your personal deficits. And this was talked about earlier, this idea that it's really about deficits. And we're already starting to hear that, even listening to the COVID crisis, when we hear someone say, you know, if this group of people would just stop drinking, they can survive this crisis, right? Those are really neoliberal kinds of narratives. And they're really important because they're really predicated on kind of the decisions that we make and why we make them. So this idea that we've got to think about the structure of our economy differently, we've got to, it has absolutely been sick. It's actually been predicated on looking at growth and not looking at people. So let me go through this a little bit more quickly. So I'm going to suggest some other ways that we can talk about this and really think about the racial wealth gap that we haven't really done before and hasn't really been tied to thinking about racial wealth and equality. Because a lot of times we talk about this in terms of business ownership or home ownership, these things that really are not necessarily things that are just about the wealth that people own. I mean, to own a home, you need to have wealth. To own a business, you need access to capital. So there's other ways that we can begin to tackle this issue and think about this differently. And one is really thinking about corporate power. And that corporate power really plays this role. And this really gets back to this issue of concentrated wealth and who has political power, right? And so we can think about this in just one quick example. When we think about the fact that we really allowed corporations, by kind of deregulation, by financialization, to actually was really that led the way in the last recession, right? Those rules were kind of thrown out the window because we were not paying attention to the markets. We were not actually really monitoring and tracking and actually having accountability for them. And so kind of really going forward, we have to think about this, even this deep recession that we're in, and how corporate power actually determines how wages are set, kind of who gets paid sick leave. But it also really speaks to kind of who has the power to determine those things and how wealth is extracted. I'll finally say that we have to think about how corporate power is connected to public power, how actually those things are connected in the ways that corporations can erode public power and our ability to have universal goods. And so really thinking about how do we think about public goods, especially in this context right now. Those things that we really are seeing fall apart in this crisis because we saw that there's really no infrastructure for them. We're lucky in California that we do have leaders that understand that much more than other parts of the nation. But the idea that corporations can actually erode and corrupt public power has to really, lead to how wealth can actually get extracted out of communities of color. One of the things that we have to do is de-silo, right? And really connect the idea of mass incarceration and wealth, which we haven't done as much. And how does that really look? One way it really looks in kind of bringing this all together is really thinking about what happened in the last crisis when so many local jurisdictions lost money. They had budget shortfalls. And so what's the thing that they actually did to raise revenue? They started charging criminal fines and fees, and they could do it because they could police and surveil Black and Latinx neighborhoods because they were already segregated, right? And what they did was create these fines and fee structure to make up their budget shortfall. And now we have throngs of people with this immense criminal debt, right? And so this is totally just extracts wealth out of communities of color. It pulls wealth out of families. We're seeing that more and more. California collects about $250 million in criminal debt. That just the fines they put on, the fees they put on top of fines, right? So this is a really it's a big business. If we think about corporations that can use telephone calls, for example, to extract private prisons, right? So these things we have to connect and not just see them as a criminal justice issue, but as a wealth extraction issue. And that's why when I look at this framework and thinking about solidarity, we can actually build solidarity by working with people who are working on criminal justice, who are working on economic issues, to really think about how we break up this power and how we hold our local government accountable. The whole thing here is we need new ways of building power. I think worker power in this moment takes on even greater meaning when we think about people fighting for paid sick leave, fighting for basic benefits, fighting for basic dignity at work. And so really tackling racial wealth inequality, I think moving forward and like conquering the sickness that we have has to be built and predicated on worker power. There's also another notion that could help build solidarity and help bring us together, and that's thinking about greater governance and democratization of capital. And what I mean by that is basically that, you know, workers are everyday people and live in communities. And there's ways that we can think about how do we get people involved in being able to make greater economic decisions for their lives. And one way to do that is build democratic institutions, not just through voting, that's one and very important area, but also through local kinds of governance in our local communities. It's also ways that people are coming together across the country, and what's being shown here is being done in Boston, to really make decisions about how money comes into their community, what businesses they'll support with greater capital, and that can be done in a community process. So that's another mechanism. I want to kind of end on the note of narrative shift and why that's important in this context and what it has to do with wealth inequality. These narratives are driving, they are root causes of racial inequality, of even class inequality, right? And one of them is tying personhood to a job, meaning that Americans basically believe that if you don't work in what's seemingly not the care economy where you're taking care of a relative at home and not getting paid, but that you have work in a mainstream economy. And when I mean personhood, I mean people don't believe you're a fully realized human being. And if they don't believe you're fully realized, they don't feel that they need to support you, right? That means you need to do something to make better decisions for yourself. And I think this is going to play out really in a very interesting way post-crisis when we look at possible criminalization of unemployment. We already have a lot of work rules, right? And this is a way to really how this narrative has driven down and decimated our social safety net. Manuel talked about anti-Black racism. Anti-Blackness itself is a driving cause of some of these policy decisions, right? And basically, I'm not just talking about what it does for Black people. I'm talking about what it does to all people who are swept up in policies that are predicated on anti-Blackness. And this is a belief that there's fundamentally these tropes about who wants to work, right? Who really wants to take care of their families, and they're predicated on anti-Blackness. So, you know, I believe that anti-Blackness in itself can build solidarity because we're all swept up in this. And we can see it in a place like California where Latinx groups are disproportionately affected because of anti-Black racism and anti-Blackness. And finally, I'll just say this idea of toxic individualism, that we have to go it alone, that what you do is really based on kind of your own personal decisions. You need to take personal responsibility. Really tears at our social fabric. It really is the antithesis of building solidarity, of building a more inclusive economy and more mutuality. And it fundamentally drives policies away from kind of collective beneficial impact. So that's it. I'll stop there. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about racial wealth and equality.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we deeply appreciate your joining us today and sharing, you know, what was, I think, some timely and super, you know, I think complex intersections of race and our economy and our culture and, you know, and our biases, you know, and how they impact this conversation. So I know we are running just a few minutes behind, folks. Our next session, we do want to give people the opportunity to take a few minutes of a break, just a 5-minute break. And when you come back, you're going to be put into your Zoom rooms. You'll find yourself in your Zoom room for your next conversation and dialogue. So before you take that break, I'd like Dr. Benner and Dr. Pastor, if you'd like to let folks know what you'd like them to focus on. I'm sure they'll be unpacking Anne's you know, great presentation and focusing on what other issues would you like them to talk about.
So in the second breakout group, we thought it could migrate a bit more to talking more about your current work in the sectors that you're working in, the organizations you're working in, and then really trying to think about sort of how might this framework change what you do yourself in the context of that work going forward.
And I'll just add 2 things. First, I'm changing my background to a vault in honor of the Federal Reserve. But you'll notice that the vault is open, so we're going to liberate some of that money for people who've been frozen out by the neoliberal economy and the racial wealth gap.
Then you have to hide yourself. You have to, so you can't be a part of this.
My fingerprints are all over it. But the second thing I really want to thank Anne for what she said. Chris's directions are perfect and clear. Thank Anne for being part of this conversation, and also make the point that what we're trying to do here is to not say, well, this is a framework and we thought it up in our heads and here it is. This actually emerged out of a set of conversations of which Anne was a very critical part. And we are really viewing this today as a way of having a conversation. In our view, our economy is too important to be left to the economists. And theory shouldn't be top down, it should be bottoms up and bubbled up from these kind of conversations. So I really want to thank Anne for influencing our thinking very early on. And I think that's part of the reason why these 2 presentations could be in such sync.
Great, thank you both. So right now you're going to get broke into your Zoom rooms. Feel free to take a 5-minute, break, screen break, mental health break, logistics break, potty break, coffee break, whatever sort of break you want to take. You've got 5 minutes, and when you come back, and please try to promptly come back. As you can tell, these are phenomenal conversations we're having. And we have even more exciting presentations, later from folks who are applying solidarity economics to their work and to their lives. So 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Here in the last little bits of conversation. Sorry if we cut some of you off mid-sentence, but we're doing our best to, you know, keep on time or on schedule as much as possible. Again, I want to, you know, shout out to the facilitators. You guys have been multitasking. You're typing into Google Docs. You're trying to make sure everybody gets involved. So appreciate that. Again, you know, folks had fun. I know Vanessa did, looking at the Google Doc and seeing what was rolling in. So at this point, we're going to have Dr. Pastor and Dr. Benner are going to give their reflections, you know, from your last conversations, and really, you know, for the day. And then I implore everyone to really, you know, hang in there and listen to the fast pitches we have next. You have some of the most best and brightest and brilliant minds coming to us from the venture capital and private equity communities. We've got an amazing you know, artistic presentation from a banker. So I think we've got some really great things in store. So hang with us. So here we go, Dr. Benner, Dr. Pastor.
Chris, I'm going to let you go first, and I sent you a text saying let's take no longer than 5 minutes together so we can put this back on time.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, there you go. So one of the things that came up in our discussion was we were trying to talk about what does this moment create in terms of opportunities that might have been unthinkable, you know, a month and a half or 2 months ago. And, you know, there's tremendous opportunities to think about universal health coverage and universal basic income, and really thinking about new housing opportunities as well, but also to recognize that there are people out there that are looking to profit on the opportunities. And, you know, in our group, Jeff was talking about the real estate market is likely to you know, correct at some point, and there's money on the sidelines waiting to jump in and profit from that rather than investing in affordable housing. So we just have to recognize that power is really at play now, and to be aware of that not everyone is interested in solidarity.
That's a really important thing, and I want to, in the spirit of moving us back, to say a couple of things. One is we are aware that the way we think about it is we call it big vision, first steps. So we do think that we need a kind of big vision. We hope that solidarity, economics as a frame, is something that people might find that resonates. It seemed like, looking at some of these comments, that it indeed does. There may be something else, but we do think that we need a sort of unifying vision, so that what often seems like a disparate set of issues and struggles and demands actually has a much more coherent strategy to it, and also a sort of way in which everything kind of comes together. That said, we need to think about what first steps are. What's the thing that we are going to kind of take away and do differently as things move forward? I think some of the stuff that's come up about worrying about the ways that people will profit, that's come up around talking about a different narrative and our connection together. I would leave you, as we transition to the next thing, with just one first step. If all of us could stop saying the economy and start saying our economy, it's all about reclaiming what our authority is collectively over the world that we build together. This is not some automatic, God-given, natural set of rules that have impoverished communities over years and rewarded others. It is a result of systematic intention that needs to be reversed, and that will only be reversed through collective action and struggle and solidarity. And it will only happen if we think that this is not something outside our ability to change, but something that's totally within our ability to change. We have to get practical on what this means for relief. I mean, I think it does mean making sure that it gets to the communities that we know were already the most distressed, and that recuperating those communities is key to recuperating the entire economy. There's a lot of things like that, but fundamentally we need to reclaim the narrative and reclaim our power. So with that, back to Michelle. And I understand, Michelle, that these fast pitches might even be faster given the timeline.
Yes, Dr. Pastor said that we should have faster pitches, which means you get 9 minutes instead of 10. But we've got some pretty powerful folks coming up. I want to share this really quickly just to give them their platform here, and to say that next you have Emmanuel. All of you should have received the agenda and the program, so you can scroll through that, you know, to see folks. I'll share these presentations with you per these folks' permission, following you know, this gathering. So Emmanuel, I'm going to turn this over to you. Just go ahead and take over the screen at will, and please, let's hear your pitch.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. So my name is Manuel Pastor, and I'm the founder of Islos Capital. Okay, how can I take over the screen? Sorry. I don't see my presentation anymore. Do I?
At the bottom of your screen, there should be a little green thing that says share screen. If you bring your mouse and drag it to the bottom of the screen.
Ah, there you go. Okay. All right. Sorry, I wasted a minute there, but I will be quick. So Islos Capital, we're a new private equity firm. We're about a year old. I told folks in some of the breakouts where I feel like even saying private equity firm is a little premature because we still haven't raised a fund, but we are actively investing and we are actively looking at companies to invest in. I'll first start out with understanding the facts, and specifically about our discussion on inclusion, communities of color. Private equity is not diverse. Only 3.9% of all private equity firms are minority owned, and only 3.8% of the assets are managed by these firms. And quite frankly, even if these firms are minority owned, doesn't mean that all the folks in those firms are of color, or the investment professionals are of color. Despite the performance of diverse owned private equity firms being actually better on average than most. If you look, 34% of diverse owned private equity funds performed in the top quartile, right? So if it was average, it'd be 25%, but it's 34%. And what I want to leave folks with is that even if you're not aware of sort of the financial markets and private equity, we cannot miss out. And we need folks. Obviously, I'm launching my own private equity firm, but we need more folks that kind of come from a kind of more socially conscious background to be creating these private equity firms, because they are at the moment one of the best ways to create wealth for the folks that create the private equity firms. Aside from creating the next Facebook or big company, creating a private equity firm is one of the most surefire way to become wealthy if you can get it off the ground. And just to give you some numbers, private equity is going from 4.7 trillion in 2016 to 10 trillion by 2025. So more than doubling the amount of money that's going into private equity firms. And if we're not creating the private equity firm, someone else will, and they're going to be the beneficiaries of that. So what are we doing at Islos Capital? We are not an impact fund. However, we think of investing and how we're creating the firm through an inclusion lens. And quite frankly, when we look at the firms and we look at how private equity is being done today, it's actually being done the way it's always been done. And usually we've identified kind of three things that are issues and that we want to address through Islos Capital. Usually they don't conduct research. They're sort of very much the kind of good old boy network. Call your buddy and find out what they think on the market. And that's sort of their way. The old way of solidarity economics is billionaires calling the other billionaire and saying, hey, how do you invest? And you kind of share best practices. They also lack proprietary deal flow in that they rely on sort of the good old boy banker network out there that kind of brings them good deals, right? And then third is they lack operating partner technical expertise. And what does that mean? That means actual use of technology. And so at Islos Capital, we're thinking of how can we be the most tech-enabled private equity firm out there, where we're objectively looking at as many deals as possible and thinking about all the ways to improve the company through technology. Otherwise, we're going to be reliant on some of the same traits of these other private equity firms from the past. Here's the business model. I'm not going to go through everything, but essentially the three pillars is better research that's more objective, bottoms up and top down sourcing, finding companies through bigger data, and techification, which is again the kind of forward leaning type of way of investing. So when we look at companies, we want to look at hungry, diverse. We want to look at, quite frankly, we want to look at any company. But what we bring to the table is that we're hungry, diverse, and we do have amazing backgrounds. And so a little bit here on sort of some stats. our firm is owned 100% by underrepresented minorities. Now, right now, it's only 2 males, and so we are actually actively looking for a third or fourth partner. We've, in aggregate, amongst us two, we've actually deployed over $25 billion of institutional capital in the past. Our 30 advisors that we have, 43% are female, 87% are of color, and they come from these companies, right? Best-in-class companies from the Goldman Sachs and McKinsey's of the world, but also, some of the kind of best-in-class tech companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft and such. And when we look at our portfolio companies, they essentially, the moment we buy a company, it's effectively minority owned because we're going to be the majority owners of the company. So it's sort of a way to kind of use the current industry constructs, but kind of flip it on its head and say, if we buy the company, all of a sudden, with a diverse, more inclusive team, we can effectively turn a 100%, company that's owned not by a diverse, inclusive team to become an inclusive company. And so that's sort of a way to shortcut corporate social responsibility and focus on that S and ESG and social equity. Here's our background. Won't dive into it, but a lot of pretty logos of companies that we've invested in the past. And one thing I'll highlight in the second bullet is that my partner and I, Anthony, we've invested in 23 companies by ourselves and from our own capital, and 13 of them have female or minority founders, so more than half. Here's a little bit of the process of how we find companies, very kind of objective, big data oriented. So again, very forward thinking on the technology front. And that creates a proprietary database. I actually created this model for an institutional fund that I used to work at called Sunstone Partners, that they've raised about $800 million. And essentially it's something that I built for them there. And now I'm kind of taking it to the next level through Ethos Capital. Here's our team. Again, kind of very diverse, probably younger in nature, but amazing experiences. Aside from 43% female and 67% underrepresented minorities, 77% of them have been founders or CEOs of tech-enabled companies or software companies. 63% of them are technical, meaning they have software engineering or product management background. They've actually built code, and they've all invested in over 50 companies. And we've also worked in dozens of countries, whether invested or actually worked in different companies. So we sort of have an elite team that is of color that were sort of ready to take on kind of Wall Street and the private equity industry. Stop there. Is there any questions?
If folks have questions, they should put them directly into the chat to you, Emmanuel. And
okay.
Are you?
Or otherwise, I'm fine. I'm done. I just wanted to make sure that yeah.
All right.
I can talk a lot about this stuff, but just wanted to kind of present this as an investment opportunity, but also a kind of way that if you ever invest in a private equity fund or help a private equity fund get created, push them for them to look more like this than what they traditionally look like.
Yeah, I think, I want to thank you, Emmanuel, because I think the other piece of this, that other I, in terms of your, invest and include would really be intentional, right? You're very intentional, and focusing on the diversity piece and focusing in on the inclusion piece, because you don't have to be, like you said, you could go to what some people might say, the path of least resistance, and build the good old boy network that reflects who's currently holding all this capital, in the hopes of making your life easier. But you've chosen not to do that. And yep. I think that is, really the model that everyone should be recognizing here, and a great takeaway, like you said, for how we may build, whether it be a company or a network or an office. How do we become more intentional about that diversity? And
I do have a couple of questions that I could quickly answer. So of the 87% minority advisors, what percent are female? It's half of them. So we only have one white female, and the rest are of color. And then what about public equity, public bank as a way to reshape and reframe the movement of solidarity capital? So I agree that public equity as well and public banking, we should focus on that too, but we're specifically focused on the fastest growing sector where the highest returns are, which is private equity. And when the largest pension fund in America, like CalPERS, says they can double the amount of private equity allocation that they do, that's where the money is at. That's where the money is being created. And I'll focus on, in the last 12 years, we've actually created about 3 billionaires of color, which is kind of, had never been done in Wall Street, right? But Robert Smith, Jose Feliciano, and Orlando Bravo. Now they're all guys, but it just shows you the trajectory of anyone that creates a private equity firm. They know how to do it. It could be, there's massive wealth creation that's happening in this space.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Emmanuel. We really appreciate your time. I genuinely appreciate your time and willingness to, give us some insight into, how you have really injected diversity into this private equity space, which is sorely needed. So again, any direct questions you have, folks, please feel free to, directly chat with any of the fast pitchers. They're still with us, the ones that you're hearing prior and the ones that you're hearing now. We're going to move on here to our next fast pitcher. And I'm really pleased to introduce y'all to Sergio Munoz, who I never can just get that N just right. And so he's going to present his equity lookbook. Sergio is a longtime friend as well. He is not only a banker and a former, VCer, he's also an artist and a producer. So he's found I think, a great way to bring all that together. It's all yours, Sergio.
Thank you, Michelle. So can everybody see my screen? All right, so thank you. Yes, my name is Sergio Munoz, and I work at the Social Change Institute at Community Health Councils. I think inspired by a lot of the things that have been said on this particular presentation, what my startup is about reclaiming the narrative. And so I am taking Dr. Pastor's first step very much to heart with my presentation. It is called the Equity Lookbook. It is a startup that's housed within a 501c3 nonprofit organization called Community Health Councils. And it's intended to be the source material for a program that we created that's called Leading for Equity. This is an active program. Our first cohort was hosted at Holman Church in South LA, and it's a collaboration between Community Health Councils, the Social Change Institute, Pacific Oaks College, and First 5 LA. Here is a sample of what it is that you're seeing, and I think the important thing to note about the use of the graphics and the use of the language is that it's very much a for us, by us type of vision that you're getting, as opposed to some of the materials that we've used in the past that I think are coming from other communities and don't really apply to us. This is a very important slide for me because what you're seeing here is what's called in the entertainment industry a character-based brand, which will then be able to be very merchandisable in the future if this were to be successful, if my startup were to be successful. And that character-based brand is a 27-year-old Mexican woman with a master's degree living in Leimert Park, and her name is Victoria. The source material that we used for the first cohort was a recycling of existing materials, some of which were academic, some of which were non-academic. And so what I'm proposing is that we create fresh source material. We do it in partnership, and then it would allow us to better reflect the following representations, which are the participants that are in the room, which are young, female, Latinas, and non-Latina Black women, and the curriculum would then be more reflective and more inclusive of the participants. This creation of the new source material would then allow us to be more translational, so we could take very heady concepts like solidarity economics and really filter them down to the grass bottoms in ways where we can make sure that everything is being fully understood and collaborated on, which is the purpose of this entire Solidarity Economics workshop, if you will, or active think tank, is to provide Dr. Benner and Dr. Pastor with some feedback on some of the concepts that they're bringing to us. This source material would then be licensable, it would be self-sustaining, and it would be capable of advancing community health councils into frontier technologies like avatars, AI bots, and mixed reality. From the data that exists, we believe that in the 100 square mile radius of South LA, there's approximately 825,000 people. Don't quote me on that figure. Maybe Dr. Pastor could actually give me a better figure if that's inaccurate. But what we're hoping for is that our total addressable market would be around 250,000. And to compare it, we had 50 people in the first cohort. So that would be a massive scaling of what would be possible given this platform. We know from the first cohort that the social needs of the residents, the biggest obstacles are legal documentation and status, issues of racial equity, gender equity, trauma-exposed communities, education, financial literacy, access to capital, and workforce opportunities. Those would all be themes within the Equity Lookbook. And the way that I started it was by connecting with one of the academics at UCLA. Her name is Melanie de la Cruz Viesca. She put together a beautiful report with one of my mentors, Dr. Sandy Darity, called The Color of Wealth in Los Angeles. And I really wanted to make that report translational to the types of mostly women that I was interacting with at home and church. Melanie introduced me to Heather McCulloch, who runs the Coalition for Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, which has 500 plus individuals. And that is our starting point. I'm looking for a platform partner so that we can consume the source material, contribute to the source material, share the source material, and interact within the group. That is a big change from how we ran the first cohort, which was done with teams of chauffeurs, caterers, interpreters, and strategic partners live in person. The lead investor for Leading for Equity is First 5 LA through the funding of the Best Start initiative. And then we also received support from Weingart by allowing us access to the Catch a Fire platform, where I found my artist that helped me to create the look of it. I'm asking for $1 million that'll be spread out through use of funds. That's 15% to administration, 30% to marketing and design, and 55% to platform and technology. And if my hypothesis for the economic impact of something like the Equity Lookbook, if all 250,000 participants were allowed a universal equity infrastructure and all of those things that are listed on the slide, the economic impact for South LA would actually be exponential. I have a very easy 8-step way to prove that hypothesis with actual data that's listed on the thing, which I can share. And this is me. If you have any questions or comments or would like to support in any way, there is all my contact information. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sergio. As you can see, you know, I really wish there was time that everybody could hear the richness of each individual's, you know, presenter's sort of journey and their sort of personal position, you know, to each of these stories. But, you know, Sergio, I know, has a passion for a long time, you know, of creating access specifically for undocumented Latinas who are, you know, working hard to support their families and their communities with very little access, you know, to any of the resources you've seen listed there. And many of those women are represented in the Leading for Equity workshops that we've been doing at home and church in South LA. So thank you again for that, Sergio. It's a super fun. I myself would like a little AI bot that that your main character has. So what we'll try to do is also share, I think, the full template when we send this out, so that you guys can have a fuller look at Sergio's Equity Lookbook, which at this point has, I think, what, 8 episodes? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm actually working on the 9th as we speak.
All right, so if you have any questions for Serge, please give him a shout out in the chat box. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you, get your feedback, and share more information and ideas. I am now excited to definitely introduce you guys to our next fantastic presenters. I'm trying to get back to my little share here. Alrighty. Sorry, I've been pretty good so far with my technology, right? Okay, so here we go. So Tracy Gray and Carmen Palafox are absolutely phenomenal women. I thought they were a fantastic way to round out our day here. They have a critical bit of information for you, not only about an innovation fund, but why and how we're going to get there. So please, Tracy and Carmen, thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. When will we learn how to unmute ourselves after all this time? Thank you so much, Michelle. My name is Tracy Gray. I am the founder and managing partner of the 22 Fund, which is a growth equity social impact fund. We invest in companies to increase their export capacity with the mission of job creation in underserved communities, and we target women and people of color entrepreneurs. And I'm going to pass to Carmen to introduce herself and to put up our presentation.
All right, let me try and do that now. And I'm sharing my screen. I don't know if you could see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
You could see it?
Yeah.
Sure. But I'm not sure that you can see the Google slides.
No, but we did it when you first started. So.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. We could just do the PDF, which I had as backup. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Carmen Palafox, and I'm a partner at Mila Capital. It's a LA-based venture fund that was started about 5 years ago, and we invest in tech you can touch. I'm also a part of a few other networks focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in venture capital. So those include Pledge LA, they include Latinx VC, and also All Raise. So let's get started.
Okay, so what we're going to present to you is a big vision to literally unleash trillions of dollars to go toward women and people of color. You heard some speakers speak about the intergenerational wealth, especially Emmanuel, who's told you some different stats on venture capital and private equity. So I entered venture and the tech sector 20 years ago, and literally the numbers have not changed in that 20-year period, and they've actually gone down. And it's due to these 10-year cycles of shocks to our economics, our economy. So to add to some of what Emmanuel said, the number of women in venture capital are 6 to 8%. And if you talk about women of color, it's even lower. Women receive 2.7% of all venture capital. Women of color, less than 1%. Latinx women, less than 0.1%. African American women, less than 0.0006%, literally a rounding error. And if you think commercial loans are going to help us, we only get 4%. Women only get 4% of commercial loans. And you might think philanthropy is really going to do it for us. Women and girls get 7% of philanthropic dollars, and women of color get 3%. So if you look at these numbers on the screen, we have 400 years before we ever get to parity. So next, Carmen's going to tell you some ways that trickle-down economics could actually work for us.
And I'm going to start and just give a very basic view of the importance of venture capital. Venture capital really fuels companies that are ubiquitous in our everyday life. here's just a few logos of the companies that have been VC backed. This does not include the recent introduction of tech like Zoom, Netflix, Starbucks, Amazon. So it's almost easier to name a company that has not been venture backed. We've talked a lot about the lack of minorities and women in venture capital. And this picture really shows the concentration of wealth and power. And why it's important is because, you know, when venture capitalists, when they invest at the very early stages, it does create a lot of wealth. One example is one of the early investors in Zoom. So Horizon Ventures was an early investor in Zoom. They invested in the Series B and the Series C, and as a result, their share ownership is now worth $3 billion. The founder of Zoom, his assets and shares are worth about $6 billion. So just trying to wrap our minds around wealth creation and the value that VC has in that role. Talked about performance, and we know now, we have reports, and there's so many studies out there that show that diverse managers outperform teams that are not diverse. And here's a few stats on that. So multiple times over, the last one really left an impression on me. First time funds outperformed established fund managers in every year except one over the past 13 years. Just something to chew on there. And because we're all economists, we're going to talk about the multiplier effect. So, you know, and this is something that Tracy talked about in terms of trickle down, right? So when you have diversity on an investment team, it's going to reflect in their underlying portfolios. So this data here is presented by Fairview Capital, which manages a fund-of-fund, and that fund invest in diverse managers. So diverse manager number one, 40% of the underlying portfolio of 650 portfolio companies featured women and minorities, on and on, 40%, 31%, 58%. I'll link this back to my own experience. So our team is made up of 2 Latinas, and we've invested in a total of 20 companies. Within our portfolio, 32% of the companies we invested in have a female CEO, 42% of the companies have a female founder, 58% of the companies were started by immigrant founders, and 47% of the companies are underrepresented minorities. Trickle-down economics works in this situation. Women investors are 2 times more likely to invest in female founders. Startups with at least 1 female founder hired 2.5 more women, and a company with a female founder and a female executives will hire 6 times more women. And I'll turn it back to Tracy to talk more about structural barriers that exist for minority and women investors.
So I'm not sure if everybody's aware of Proposition 209, but in 1997, codified in our Constitution, 209, or California Civil Rights Initiative, says that you cannot use race, sex, or gender, ethnicity for public assets. So that's employment, contracting, and education. So admissions into UCs. But what a lot of people do not know is how it impacts business. The pension funds have trillions of dollars that they invest in private equity and venture capital. But they are not allowed to use race or gender or ethnicity. So they've created these emerging manager fund programs where emerging manager is defined as their first, second, or third fund. And what it's actually doing is the pension funds from workers, from public employees, from teachers, their money is making rich white men richer. They can, if you spin out of Goldman Sachs or some other fund and you have already made billions of dollars, you can start your own fund, and therefore you are now an emerging manager. And the pension funds, CalSTRS, CalPERS, the UCs, use this as a reason to not, they use 209 as a reason not to invest in women and people of color fund managers. Next slide. So these structural barriers, I know we're going over, but I'm gonna go over, Michelle, sorry, just a little bit. Because you brought us in at the last minute, so we get a little more.
You know what, you guys are rounding it up, so I wasn't about to step in front of either of you. I know better.
I'm getting full messages from people and I'm ignoring it. So the structural barriers that exist are, they say no first-time funds, but we know for a fact there are white men first-time funds who have gotten funding from pension funds. They say you have to have a track record in what you're investing, but if you're not in the legacy private equity funds or venture capital funds, how do you get a track record? They want your work history of your team working together. How do you get that if you're not allowed into these firms, right, the current firms? And then they say you can't be, your funds are too small. Sub 100 is too small, they say, for these pension funds. Although I know of funds that are sub 100 that are getting capital. And this goal line keeps moving. So this is keeping women and people of color out of private equity. And as I said, over the 20-year period, it has not changed for us. Next slide. So we have a big solution, and it is what we're calling the Innovation Fund. It would be around $100 million coming from pension funds and foundations, which is a rounding error for the amount of money that's out there, that would seed women and people of color fund managers. And that first anchor investor unleashes billions of dollars. Carmen, why don't you go into examples that are happening in other states?
Okay, I'll give an example of Chicago. So Chicago about 10 years ago made just very active decision to start investing in women and minorities. And when they first started the program, they were at about 7% allocation to women and minority investors. In 2018, they were up to about 42%. So intentionality works. There's a Canadian program called VCCI, and this is a public-private partnership. So the Canadian government has said we will provide matching funds to investors that are going to invest in women and minorities. So we do need policy to come and step in and create those incentives that are going to attract money into women and diverse managers.
And the biggest policy that we could do right now is to repeal Proposition 209. There is an effort already started. Carmen and I and Manuel was up there in Sacramento. We presented to the Women's Caucus, and Holly Mitchell has been leading this, and they're on board to begin to repeal 209. It's the only way we can get out of this. In the past, they've tried, but because it was focused on admissions in universities, the Asian caucus was a barrier to repealing it. But we feel that focusing on businesses and fund managers, all people of color, this will help. And this will help us build intergenerational wealth. Next slide. This is a quick sampling of 12 managers. If they were seeded with this innovation fund of $100 million, we would unleash almost $750 million from all these fund managers. Many of them are impact funds and focus on the environment and people of color. Go ahead, next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about why now. Manuel said this is a relationship business, and it really is. You know, there are good old boy networks, but in the past few years, we've also created Black and Brown networks that share deal flow, that educate each other, that have boot camps. And this creates our unique edge, where then we can go invest in companies that are relatable to our communities. One more thing on why now. I wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunity in venture. So money is pouring into venture capital as we speak. Just yesterday, there was an announcement that a Bay Area fund closed a $4.2 billion fund. So these big brand name funds that are heavily concentrated in the Bay Area are continuing to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the concentration of wealth and power gets bigger and more concentrated, not just with in one gender and one ethnicity, but in one region. So in 2019, for example, 8 funds raised $1 billion plus. 8 funds raised $1 billion plus in 2019. In 2020, we already have 4 funds that have raised $1 billion plus, and we're in April. So people are leaning into venture, and the time is now.
And private equity also, the same thing's happening, but what is happening on the other side are women and people of color are having to close down their funds or stop fundraising because the institutional investors are saying we're pulling back. Well, they're pulling back from us. They are not pulling back from the legacy funds. So our call to action is anyone who is at a foundation or institutional investor who wants to help seed this innovation fund. Like I said, it's $100 million, which in this ecosystem is peanuts. And then we need you to help us repeal 209. We need the grassroots up to the treetops, and Michelle has offered to help with that. And so please contact Carmen and I'll put our emails in the chat. And I see some people are already doing that, and we can really have a huge impact during this time on growing intergenerational wealth. So thank you so much. Sorry, we went over by 15 minutes.
Oh my goodness. Well, you know what? You guys are awesome. There actually wasn't 15 minutes. That not at all. And I want to thank everybody who's still on the line. We have a quick Zoom poll. There's 2 questions that I'd like to ask everyone. If you have direct questions, again, you know, connect with everybody on the chat there. So I know that there are a lot of, I see the conversations going, so thank you. I know people are having conversations. We're gonna send these presentations to you afterwards. And Lauren, can you take over the screen and go ahead and put those 2 questions up for people to answer for us?
Yeah, so
just want to get a little bit of a reaction from you guys for all of the great fast pitches you heard. Feel free to shoot any other sort of evaluation tips into the chat. We don't have a formal evaluation, just a couple of questions about our fast pitch. So here is the first poll question. It should pop up on your screens, and just go ahead and select one.
You should be seeing the poll pop up, and this is the first question. If you're designated as a co-host, I don't believe it comes up for you. Just so you know.
Yeah, well, it's good. We see them popping up. We'll leave this one up here for just a minute. We've got about half of you so far.
And it is anonymous, I believe.
Yeah, it's anonymous, guys. There's not little names popping up over your boxes. Good deal. All right, let's go ahead and put the second one up there. I think that's, if everybody hasn't voted yet, that's probably about it.
So I'm going to, should I share the results of the first poll?
I think we're looking at it.
Not everybody, but yeah. Okay.
Now I just shared it.
Oh, not everybody. Yeah, you could share it if you like.
Okay, and then I will initiate the second poll. You should be seeing it on your end. We're getting some votes in.
Right, I think that's about it. So if you want to share those results, there we go. That is the opinions. I just want to thank everyone. I think, you know, the part about this that is really significant is that, you know, this isn't easy, right? This isn't easy. You know, creating a new and better economy that is more equitable is a heavy lift. And as you can tell in the presentations that, you know, Dr. Pastor, Dr. Benner, all of our fast pitchers, and you know, we appreciate the time that you take, because, you know, it's just not easy to present such complex and personal ideas, you know, to how we move forward. And so all we can do is take a piece of it and run. And so that's what we heard today, right? So there's pieces of this that people are taking and running with. So whether it's debt alleviation, whether it's, you know, reciprocity in the C-suite and a better diversity and equity inclusion, you know, program, whether it's, you know, the private equity space, which, as I can tell, most of us are like, that is such a foreign language that we can't even begin to think about the massive amounts of money and capital that live in these spaces, and how we would even begin to access them, right? Or how we better educate one another, you know, and educate, you know, our communities through Sergio's lookbook. So, you know, and Tracy and Carmen, you know, policy, you know, I've been wanting to overturn Prop 209 since before it existed because I knew, you know, all those years ago, what the negative repercussions of that would be, right? So there's so many different ways that we can eat this elephant. So we all just got to like take off a piece and start chewing, you know, in the best way that we know how. So I just want to thank everybody, Dr. Pastor, Dr. Benner, and you know, any final thoughts for us?
I just want to reiterate something you said at the beginning, is that I really want to thank Lauren and Vanessa and Mackenzie in particular for making this a seamless experience. I don't know about anybody else, but it just, I mean, we were a little bit on pins and needles about whether or not this technology would work, and I feel like we will all be worshiping Lauren Portillo Perez after this event.
Yay!
Thank
Awesome.
you, Manuel. Glad it went well.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Please enjoy the rest of your